Hi everyone, and welcome to our video all about the features used in classification. What we're going to be doing in this video is having a look at the specification reference 4.2.2c part 1, the features used to classify organisms into the 5 kingdoms, and obviously we're going to have a look at some of the similarities in those observable features in original classification. First thing then is we need to understand the definition for the term species. Now this is something you should have done at GCSE, and when we talk about a species we're referring to a group of organisms that can freely interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So realistically we've got two parts to this definition. The first bit is obviously identifying the fact we've got a group of organisms that are able to interbreed with one another, and the second bit is they're producing fertile offspring. Now when we consider that definition of a species, we've got some problems that come about because it's limited in its scope, for the simple fact that obviously here we're talking about organisms interbreeding to produce fertile offspring, but that doesn't take into account any of those organisms which are going to be reproducing asexually. So we wouldn't really be able to classify something as a species if they're asexual organisms based on that definition alone. We also couldn't use that if we're trying to classify things that are no longer living and all we have is a fossil record of them, because quite clearly we can't see, are they breeding together to produce fertile offspring? So we have limitations. Therefore, what we use is an upgraded definition of a species, which is our phylogenetic definition. And this quite simply is a group of individual organisms that are very similar in appearance, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and genetics. So because we're no longer reliant on this ability to breed with one another to produce fertile offspring to classify them as being of the same species, we can apply that phylogenetic definition to fossils, to asexual organisms, to sexual organisms. It's a covers all bases definition there. When we're actually thinking about those members of a single species, then we can say that they occupy the same niche in an ecosystem. And that term niche basically means the role of a species within that ecosystem. So what we're looking at there is where in the environment it is. How does that organism get its energy? How does it interact with the other species? And how does it interact with the whole physical environment? So that niche there very much looks at what does that species do within the ecosystem as a whole. And this was actually a term that was used in these early classification systems. Now, when we go back to some of the earliest classification systems, they were rather simple in their nature because we had a grand total of 2 kingdoms, plants and animals. Now, if we're kind of looking at the amazing diversity of species on the planet today that we know about, obviously that looks very simplistic. But bear in mind, we have a much greater understanding of our natural world because we've travelled more extensively as a species. We've also had greater developments in technology. Things like microscopes being invented led to ideas changing because all of a sudden we could see more information. We could see things like bacteria. Before this, you didn't see bacteria. You couldn't see them with the naked eye. Therefore, it was only when those microscopes came about that we were able to then modify our ideas. And then obviously when we developed the electron microscope, we were then able to gain further information and therefore review our classification system even further. So one of those common themes, if you like, through biology is as technology advances, then our understanding of the living world will advance, and this sometimes leads to a necessity to reclassify or to tweak certain ideas that we have. What we are going to do now is have a little look at these main kingdoms that we've looked at and understand those key features that allows us to classify organisms into one of those key kingdoms we need to know about. So our first kingdom is prokaryote. Now prokaryote are prokaryotic cells. This means they have no nucleus. That's our go-to answer about a prokaryotic cell, is there is no nucleus. Instead, the DNA is arranged as a loop and it's not organised into those chromosomes. We would also be able to say that the DNA is termed naked DNA, and that just means it's not wrapped around those histone proteins. We would also find that we have the smaller 70S ribosomes present, and there are no membrane-bound organelles within that cell. In terms of the size of a typical prokaryotic cell, they're between 0.1 and 5 micrometers, and these would either be free-living or parasitic organisms. Our second kingdom, Protoctista. Now, protoctistans are eukaryotic cells, and these are mostly free-living, single-celled organisms. And what we actually find is the protoctistans are a bit weird, if I'm being honest, because they've got various plant-like or animal-like features in them. So they can be either autotrophic or they can be heterotrophic in their nutrition. So what we ended up with was actually the necessity for this kingdom to take care of the things that didn't really fit in plants, but they also didn't really fit in animals. They needed somewhere else to go. Hence, Protoctista came into existence. Third kingdom, the fungi. Again, these are eukaryotic cells, which means they will have a nucleus there. And we've got a range of different versions of fungi here. We do have single-celled organisms like the yeasts, and we also have multicellular fungi. Now, if we've got a multicellular fungus, then it's going to have this mycelium made of the individual hyphae. So what we end up with basically are these little strands, which are a hyphae, that go together to make this larger structure called the mycelium. Key difference between our fungi and our plant cells is, although they have cell walls, their cell walls are made of this substance called chitin, whereas obviously plant cell walls are made of cellulose. They also have this multinucleate cytoplasm, which is one of those features that really does set fungi apart from the others. And these ones will either be free-living and they will be saprophytic. Now, if we remember, saprophytic or saprophytes are these organisms that will release their enzymes onto the surface of the material they wish to digest. The enzymes will do their thing, and then we can just absorb, obviously, those nutrients into the organism at that point. Our next kingdom is Animalia, the animal kingdom. Now, first point, these are eukaryotic cells, which means they do have a nucleus. They've got ATS ribosomes, membrane-bound organelles, the whole shebang. And our animal kingdom is made up of multicellular organisms. Their nutrition is heterotrophic, so they're going to be eating another organism in order to provide them with that energy requirement they've got, and they're usually able to move. But this is a diverse kingdom, as you can see from the lovely little pictures I've given you at the bottom of our little fennec fox there with its huge ears. We've got our narwhals, because who doesn't want a giant horn on your head? And of course, the tiny blue poison frog. Who doesn't love them? We then come on to the plantae kingdom, or the plant kingdom. Again, eukaryotic cells. These are also multicellular, but they have a cell wall. So the fact they've got a cell wall sets them apart from Animalia. And the reason that their cell wall is not the same as our fungi is because it's made of cellulose, whereas in our fungi it was chitin. They're going to get their nutrition through autotrophic means, which means they're obviously utilising things like photosynthesis in order to obviously provide them with their nutritional needs. Now, throughout that, we have mentioned these two terms relating to nutrition, autotrophic and heterotrophic. So when we're referring to something as being autotrophic, this means it's going to produce organic molecules from inorganic ones. So think about processes like photosynthesis here. If something is heterotrophic, that means that it's going to have to feed on another organism to obtain the nutrients that it requires. So obviously that's what we see with our animals. because animals will be feeding on things like plants or other animals in order to gain the nutrients required. Now, one thing you need to be able to do here is know those key features of the different kingdoms, because you can get questions on the A-level papers where they're going to give you an organism, so they're going to give you a diagram typically with a few key features labelled on there, and then ask you which kingdom it should be classified into and why you believe that. So obviously what you need to be doing is looking at it. Is it multicellular? Is it single-celled? Is it going to have a cell wall or not? What's the cell wall made of? Does it have a nucleus? And all of these are those ways that we can then narrow it down to establish which kingdom it's in and therefore correctly identify it. But if you get one of those questions, do remember that you literally have to go through and say, it is not whichever kingdom because justify that one. Do that for each one in turn, and then of course don't forget to say, therefore I believe it is, and then whichever kingdom you think it is. So make sure that you fully explain your answers should a question like that occur. As always, I do suggest that you subscribe to the channel so you can see when we next update with any videos, and of course head on over to my A-Level Biology website where you can find a range of other resources all geared towards helping you do well in your A-Level Biology studies.